I'm Ryan, and today we are going to work on an acrylic landscape lesson. All of the tools and materials will be listed in the video description, and if you'd like help with the drawing process, I'll have the traceable up over on Patreon, along with the reference photo for color matching. With that said, let's jump into it. So today we're going to be painting a warm seascape scene, and we're going to start in the background here with a round pointed brush. As you can see, the top of it will be great for detail, and the rounded sides are fantastic for rendering more soft blends for things like that of clouds. Now, before we grab any pigment, I'm actually going to dip the bottom third of my brush in some water and wipe off the excess. This is going to make it damp and ensure that our paint stays wet for a longer period of time, and it'll help us with our blends. So now we're going to begin by taking quite a bit of titanium white, moving that to a fresh spot here on our palette. We'll grab a hint of our primary yellow and about half that of cadmium red light hue. We'll mix these together, create a nice warm bright light. Then, once it's fully blended, we're going to take this pigment and we're going to apply it right along the top of our showing sky here. We have a larger cloud right there, so we're working around it. I'm using the small point at the end of the brush to work the details and the edges, and then when I get more into this open area, I'll apply the body of the brush and we'll cover significantly more space very quickly. Just like that. I'm also continuously moving down. And there we go. Once I get to just past that halfway point in the sky, I'm going to take off the extra paint on my brush. I'm going to head back to my palette. We'll interject some extra yellow and red. Again, minuscule amount of yellow and about half that of red. We want to do this in very small portions because, as you can see quickly, it starts to change. And we want it to be a gradual change. So now, I'm going in to around the bottom area. We are applying this new mixture, and then I'll start blending up into our previous application, which should still be wet because our brush was damp when we picked up that paint. By applying a very minimal amount of pressure, we can render a soft blend, and it'll go back and forth, up and down a couple of times, just to make sure it's consistent. Though, if you do get some brush strokes, it won't look bad, it'll just look like very soft clouds in the distance. So don't worry about that. Now, yet again, we're going to take a bit more of our cadmium red light hue, and mix that in to that same mixture. And over here you can see the initial mixture. I'm trying to continuously move slightly more in one direction or the other so that I can continuously compare it to our previous applications. Now I'll apply this right down here at the bottom yet again, and I'll start working upwards. I like to initially work around the edges of other subjects, and then once that's done, and I have a clean application, I work more into the body of the sky because generally when you have fresh paint on your brush, that is when you are best able to render a sharp line, and so I like to get that done first. Now that we have a nice gradient, we're going to start taking some additional cadmium red, moving that to a clean spot on our palette. We'll take a little bit of Mars black, about an equal mixture of titanium white, and we'll start mixing up what's going to look like a bit of a purple. Generally, when a red is very desaturated and a little bit darker, it does start to look like purple, and that's what we're looking for right here. So, as you can see, I'm just continuously mixing it. We'll make it a bit brighter because it is on the horizon, and the farther away it is, the more light it's going to be soaking up. So once I have my pigment like that, just going to move into the horizon, and I'll start applying that just like this. Remember to do the edges first because that's when you have the most opportunity to render the best clean lines. And then once your edges are done, like that, you can apply more pressure with your brush and fill in those areas. Now over here, you can see that I'm starting to do those edges again. However, my brush, I've essentially run out of paint. I've essentially run out of water. So, rather than continuing and applying pressure and probably rendering something messy, I just took that paint off, made my brush damp. I'll head back to my palette and grab some more. So, as you can see, when we get a bit closer, it's actually quite evident that the pigment we're using is semi-transparent, and you can see little portions of canvas through varying brush strokes, and that's essentially occurring because we are working with a damp brush, and when we thin that paint to make it last longer, we also physically thin it, so you can actually see through it to a point, and this just means that we need to go back in and do some additional layering. So you can do this while it's still wet, though it does work a little bit better if it's dry, if you do want to wait that extra time. But we're going to refine this layer, we're going to add an additional application to it, and this is something you should honestly consider with most of your paintings, especially if you're working with acrylics. Oil is not so much, but it really does make the paintings look better. And what's great about kind of being forced to go back and reapply pigment is that you get to make adjustments. You get to change things. Every time you apply paint, you should be learning something from it. And so we just learned about this pigment. I looked at it, I said, okay, you know what, I like that, but how could I make it better? And I decided I'd like it better if it was a little brighter. So I just added some titanium white to the mixture. Now I'm going back in, I'm doing my second layer, and as you can see, it's no longer an issue transparency-wise, and I have a pigment I like a little bit better. So this is just a friendly reminder that if you're working on skies, especially with colors like yellow and red because they are quite thin, that doing a second layer is generally going to make a big difference. And doing a third or fourth layer also isn't a bad idea. It all depends on how much time you want to spend on each piece. But I like this significantly better. What you do need to make sure of, though, while you're doing this, is that right here you can actually see a bit of a darker outline on this cloud from that underlayer. It was almost like I was painting inside of those lines. Make sure you don't do that. Make sure when you're doing additional layers that you do go back over those edges. You make them bright. You make them whatever pigment you are now applying, and you are not treating them like things to stay inside of. If anything, I would advise actually moving out of them a little bit in different areas, because that's going to give you the best look. There we go. I'm also now pressing the body of my brush more into this. I'm doing a little sweeping motion, which is giving me a softer look to my clouds rather than a hard edge. We have all of those lines implemented, and now this is essentially just giving us a nice extra little effect. It's giving them some movement, and that's really nice. So now while I wait for this layer to dry to do another one, what I'm going to do is I'm going to move back into my oranges. So I will take some of my primary yellow, a little bit of my cad red, light hue, mix those up into a good orange, then we'll add quite a bit of titanium white, just like that. And I want to add some Mars black into this, but if I do, because we have so much yellow, it'll probably turn green. So I'm going to make it a red dominant orange first, like that. And now we should be safe. So I'll take a hint of Mars black, not too much, I'll wipe off the excess over there. And just like that, we have the start to a darker orange. Just recognize that when you are making these darker oranges, that your orange does need to be more red than yellow. Now that I have this, I'll start creating the base layer for some of my clouds right in here. You can see that there's a little separation between those. And this is probably going to look quite thin in the initial applications as well, because it is orange dominant and we are working with quite a bit of yellow, which really is the most thin pigment we could be working with. Now there isn't a cloud over here in the reference photo, but I thought it would be nice to kind of balance things. So I'm just going to work that over there. And it's worth noting that if you're ever having troubles kind of figuring out what colors to use and how to balance them, actually printing out the reference photo and then painting directly on it can be incredibly useful. I actually do that a lot, and I found that it really helped me figure out things in the long term. With that said, I am going to take more of our purple, which has dried, so you know what? I will make more of that. And we'll interject this into the new clouds as well. Almost there. And that should do it. I like to keep the initial mixtures on there just so I can see what they looked like and I can compare with them should I need to make them again. And with this pigment, I'm applying it to the tops of these clouds. And then I'm blending it down. And I'm doing that because the bottom of the clouds is going to get a lot of warm light reflecting off of it, but the tops are going to be darker. There you'll see that they're a bit more thick, that the light can't penetrate them to the same point, and the light is literally moving under them, not atop them. So we're just applying this on the bottom and we're doing a blend in the other direction. I'm also just using the head of the brush, that little point, and I'm applying as little pressure as possible in this process. Now from there, let's continue by making a slightly brighter orange. So I'll just add some titanium white to the mix. I'll add a little bit of red, a little bit of yellow, not much of each. And then I'll take this and I'll apply it right down here at the bottom. This is going to thicken it and make it look a lot better. There we go. Doing a slight circular motion with my brush to create slightly softer edges. You don't have to do this, it's purely an aesthetic, subjective choice, but it can be nice. Entirely up to you. And then I'll also work a little bit of this into the top zone, the clouds over here, just so it's a bit more cohesive. From there, let's get a little closer. Now I'm switching to another round pointed brush, and this one is about 1/8 of an inch, so it's just a little bit smaller for fine detail work. Now I'm going to start by making it damp, then I'll look at the highlight color that I used before, I'll work right beside it, and I'll make a slightly brighter variant of that pigment. So here we have orange, now we have titanium white, and we'll add a bit more yellow, and we'll add a bit more titanium white. And I'll start slowly moving in a direction because this initial mixture, it's darker, it's saturated, and I'm trying to get something that's less saturated and lighter. So rather than having to continuously remix with all of this, I just take a portion of it and then I move in a different direction, and then I use that to make the mix I actually want. So there we have the pigment I actually want. Now my brush, if you look at it, has a lot of paint on it right now. So if I want to apply this, I'd probably make a much larger mark than I want. So I'm just going to take off the excess. Going to take my clean brush and that new pigment. I'm going to take my pinky finger, ground it on the canvas to take out any shake that there might be. And then I'll head to the bottom of my cloud and I'll incorporate this highlight. Then I'll move to a different cloud, and I'll do that with all of them. Now I do think the mixture could be a bit more yellow, so we will take more yellow, take that white, and this again is another benefit to applying thick layers, doing things multiple times. You get to take a step back, ask yourself, okay, I like it, how do I make it better? How do I improve? How do I iterate? Here the answer is just more yellow. It's not too much more. It's still subtle, relatively. But while you're doing this, again, that rule of making sure you don't have any edges showing the initial color is so important. So make sure you scan the edges, make sure you check those bottoms, and make sure that that new bottom is simply the new pigment. There we go. Now this is a very small area of the canvas. It's worth noting that there really won't be too much attention here for very long, but it's nice to put in the effort for the people who really do want to look through the painting. This is the type of work that's really going to say, you know, I'm serious about what I'm doing and I care about every little inch of this piece. I'm also going to add a little bit of our yellow around this cloud, and I'm working essentially around it, and then I'm slightly tapping inside occasionally. There we go. Now we still do need to go back and add an extra layer to this, and we'll do that in a second. But right now let's just make sure we have a relatively thick, relatively good application with our yellows. There we go. Now I will switch back to the larger brush. I will mix up more of that purple that we used, and I can still see it in my mixtures, which is great. I'm going to make it brighter yet again. So significantly more white than anything else in this. You can see that it's brighter than the middle ones. Let's give it a try. Okay, so as you can see, definitely brighter. It's nice and thick. Let's make it even brighter though. So yet again, I'm not mixing the entirety of it. I'll add this beside it, I'll grab a little bit, and then I'll move it over. That way I don't have to mix too much of a color I won't need that much of. There we go. Just going to work my edges first, as we always talk about. Blend a little bit into that previous yellow application that we just did. Again, edges first. Don't leave any darker edges. And then we can fill in the body. Now that we have a new base here, it's important that we remember that the purple is different, so I will add that up into the tops of these and just make sure that it's cohesive, because we used the color from before on them and that color from before has now changed. So I'm just going to work backwards and make sure that it all, again, works the way we want to. Let's start moving up in the canvas though. So right here we have a really large cloud, and this has a massive amount of detail, a lot of orange highlights, a lot of yellow highlights, but the base layer is essentially this. So what we're going to do, we're going to make sure that our brush is actually relatively dry for this next step, because we want to cover a lot of space and we want a thick application. Now for this, I'm going to remix the color that we had before, and I'm going to mix a lot of it. So here we have a lot of red, here we have a lot of white, here we have a little bit of Mars Black, not too much, very minuscule to begin with, and I'll start that mixture right here, right beside, that way I can consistently gauge what we need to do with it. Say, okay, you know what, it definitely needs more black to get that desaturated look, but that'll of course make it a lot darker than what we need it to be. Now we'll make it brighter again, titanium white. Just like that. We're getting closer. More titanium white. Oh, closer yet again. Not adding a massive amount at any point. Taking it slow. Now generally I advise when you have a massive amount of paint on your brush to simply wipe it off, but in this scenario we need it. And we're not trying to work around any real edges, anything too definitive right now. We do have edges, we do have openings in the cloud, as you can see right here, but quite honestly, that can be changed, and when we apply the color for the actual sky, we'll have to work on those edges anyway. So here I am utilizing all of that pigment. I am pressing the body of the brush into the canvas rather than just using the tip. Here I'm just using the tip along those edges, but I am making use of this pigment. Something you might find, however, that when you do apply pigment straight from the brush in the mix, that you might get a variety of different colors, and that's just because different portions of the brush have different mixes. If you look at the base of the brush right now, the bristles, you see a bit of an orange, and if I apply the brush like that, you'll get that, which is okay. We have enough pigment that we can kind of blend that out, just something to consider. Now, despite the fact that we don't have any water in our mixture, as this is starting to dry, I can see some slight thin areas. So I'm reworking those as we go, and I'll probably have to do 2 layers of this, but right now, just to save a little bit of time, so you don't have to watch me paint a big splotch for 10-15 minutes. I'm just going to do the edges here so you know where we are applying this. And then I'll go back in and do a better job and a second layer. So anything in here is being painted with this thick pigment. And then we have some clouds up here as well. But we'll do more with that later. So I'm just going to fill this in, and I will see you in a minute. So as you can see, I have my second layer painted on there. It's just about dry, but in the process, I actually lost an opening in the cloud right here. I lost an opening in the cloud right here. And I just wanted to note that that is going to happen when you do start painting these larger areas. It's easy to kind of get ahead of yourself and move over areas you didn't want to, but that's okay. And I'm going to deal with that now by just taking some titanium white. Doesn't really matter if it's diluted or not, just really something bright that's going to be distinctive against this. And I'm going to just start painting in where I want that opening to be for later on. So when I go in with the actual color for the sky, I'll know to paint over this area. And if you're a little lost as to where these areas are that you may have lost, you can always A, look at the traceable, B, look at the reference photo, or C, just rewind the video back to the start when you can see the drawing in the opening shot. So there are a couple of different options. I'm currently just looking over at the reference photo, figuring out where this is, and I'm also playing with it a little bit. Here I have a break in the opening, so we have some of that cloud moving through. I think that's interesting. Using the sharper point on the brush to do all of this, and you can see that there's a bit of a movement up here, much like the cloud itself, so it's really dynamic and interesting. There we go. Again, you don't need the best application, just something to note where it is. With that said, we are now going to let that dry, and we will head back down into here and start doing some highlights. So now we're going to take our 1/4 inch round pointed brush. We are going to take quite a bit of our yellow, about half that of red, create an orange that is red dominant. Then we'll take some titanium white to thicken it and desaturate it, just like we did before. And then I think I'm going to make it slightly more red dominant, and I'm going to test it right down here. I can see that it's more saturated than what I want, so I'll add some extra titanium white, like that. Test it with the colors that we have pre-established. It looks good. So now I'll take this pigment and I'll start applying it right down at the bottom of our cloud. And what you're going to notice is that it is going to be semi-transparent, regardless of if you have water on your brush or not, because we are working with a lot of yellow and we are applying it over a darker base. Now, a darker base like this would generally show through significantly more so than a lighter base like that of the actual canvas. So this is just something, again, we need to accept that we're going to have to do multiple layers of, but that's a good thing because it'll allow us to reshape and retry different applications. But I'm starting at the bottom here because the light is going to be hitting the bottom of this cloud, and we're going to have different protruding areas. So here, this part of the cloud it protrudes, and the bottom of this area will get some extra light. So I'm just starting next to where our sky will be, and then I'm starting to move in. I'm creating different applications, different sizes, different shapes. I know that this is slowly rotating in by the reference photo, so I'm just following that off to the side. And you know what? It looks like we also have another one that comes from over here, but we have this darker area in between. And if you're going to do this without the traceable or reference photo, you can do that. Just make sure that you're consistently iterating on this and making sure that your applications are always slightly different, that you're not going to create the same spacing, that you're not going to create the same miniature cloud. Just make sure you are consistently doing things differently. Now, I just about ran out of paint on the tip of my brush, so I am going to clean it off, which does mean I'm going to add a lot of water to my brush. I'm going to dry it as well as I can. I'll come back, grab more of that pigment, and I will continue creating these little clouds. And here breaks off into a myriad of smaller ones, which eventually move down into here, like that. And the more I look at the photo, the more I want this to be a bit more of a coral color rather than a pure orange. But this will be a good base regardless. So I'm going to continue with it. We'll just move this up here. I can see that there's a little bit of a protruding spot there. And then once we get to this point, it essentially stops, and then there's going to be another cloud up there. But I'll deal with that in a little bit. We've been applying this, and it's worth noting that the bottom of all of these strokes is sharp, as you can see, and the top, it kind of moves up in a bit more of a wispy motion. It's okay if the top is slightly more translucent and you get a bit of a gradient, but you want the bottom area to be nice and crisp. So when I do this, I generally start with the bottom and then I do a bit of a blend up. And if you also notice, all of my strokes aren't horizontal. It's not the continuation of the stroke. Sometimes it does protrude, and that just looks like the light is wrapping its way up around these different clouds like that. So just something else to consider. Now, again, I like this a lot. It does need to be more coral, but for consistency's sake, I'm going to mix more of this pigment. I'm going to take this new pigment that is the old pigment, and we're going to do the top of the sky with it first. And then for our second layer, we'll make that color change. Now, what I'm about to note is something that I say in really just about every single one of these painting tutorials, and that's if you're working with acrylic paints, at some point in your painting, you are going to have a very awkward looking painting. You're going to have an awkward aesthetic. And that's just because acrylic paints are so layer driven. You need to apply a lot of pigment, you need to apply a lot of layers, you need to continuously change things and allow them to grow. And to do that, you have to put in base layers. And those base layers generally aren't as detailed, they generally don't have the nice, vibrant colors you want in the end, but they're necessary for building those foundations. So this right here is a part of the painting which is not going to look great. And I really like to emphasize that because I know a lot of us, we might paint that bottom area and we say, oh, the painting, it's going so good. I love what I'm doing. This is fantastic. And you get really excited about it. And then something like this happens and you say, oh no, I've ruined it. But you haven't. This is a natural part of the process. This is something that needs to occur. And it's going to look great just like this in a little bit. You just need to have faith, you need to keep painting, you need to keep layering, and just keep iterating on it, because eventually it will look fantastic. I say this in all of the lessons because in all of them at some point things do look quite awkward, quite unfinished, but they're meant to. And that's okay. It happens to all of us. It's happening to me right now. And I am extremely confident that this is going to look really, really good in about an hour from now. So don't worry about it, honestly. so easy to get discouraged, but if you just hang in there, you really can end up with something really great. So here I am starting to go back over some of the thin areas down below. It's not the right color, but it's going to help me just create that base. So as things dry, I jump back into it, as you can see. You can also notice that this cluster is very different from this cluster, which is very different from this, which is very different from this. And it's that consistent iteration that's really going to get you something special. Now I'm looking at this one over here, and I can see that we have a little bit of an interesting movement here, and then it kind of breaks off. And then we have a lot of really small clouds up here. So it's not necessarily these larger bunches that work more horizontally. They're actually clouds that are moving in these directions. Like that. And I'm actually going to do a lot more of these with the coral color I actually want to finish on. Right now I'm just kind of sketching them in so I have a rough idea of where they should be. But so far I'm happy with this as a foundational layer, as a base layer, as something that's just getting the canvas ready for what it could be. Now at this point I really don't want to work on top of this while it's wet, so I'm going to let it dry fully, then I'm going to come back in 5 to 10 minutes, we'll mix more of the appropriate color, the color we actually want to work with, and then we'll go ahead and we'll start layering that on, and soon refining. So while our pigment here was drying, I was testing different colors here on my palette to figure out what I wanted this to be, and you can see that I actually tried a couple of different applications just to give it a shot. Now that this has dried, we can continue, and I did find a color I really liked, which did end up being this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take some titanium white, we'll grab some of our cadmium red light hue, we'll grab a little bit of Mars black, not much. I feel like I always need to preface the fact that we are using an extremely minimal amount of that Mars black. And here you can see it actually got quite close to that for a second, but we do want it to be more of a coral color. So it's quite close there. We do need a hint of yellow. And just like that, we essentially remixed the color that I really liked before. Now, it's worth noting that this area will eventually have oranges and yellows on top of it, much like the bottom of these clouds, but this is the base we really do need to build first. Now this is going to go on much easier because we are building on top of a lighter layer rather than a darker layer. So we won't have to do additional layers with this like we would have had to with the orange. And again, because we are working on top of a color that is different, it is imperative that we make sure that we get new, fresh edges. We don't want it to look like it has an outline of oranges. And this is something I see all the time, and it's something I occasionally do myself still. It's one of those things that's just so easy to forget about and kind of look past, but it really does make a big difference in the end. Now, I'd also like to talk about a couple of different types of clouds as we go about this, because this right here is light that is rolling up the back of this cloud. However, we have other clouds like that of these, which are actually individual little clouds. These are flying right under this larger cloud, and so this isn't wrapping. Now, this is an important distinction to make because these are going to have rather sharp, or at least consistent, edges all the way around. You can make them a bit more fluffy if you want, or you can make them sharp, entirely up to you. You could just follow the photo if you don't really want to decide, but that's something that's really, really good to note, because these, because they wrap, again, we need to make sure that the base of them is nice and sharp, and then you can actually have the rest of it kind of climb up into the cloud. So I'm doing a bit of a vertical stroke there, with a slight bend or a twist. And you can do that here and just make it a bit softer. And that way it looks like there's a gradient. It makes it look like the light is slowly dissipating as it moves up into the rest of the cloud. But again, it's imperative that the bottom line is nice and sharp. So the difference between adding this light to pre-existing clouds rather than making clouds is that the bottom line is sharp and the top is blended to a point, where these, it's just more consistent. It's one or the other. It's up to you. There we go. Making sure we cover the entirety of our oranges. And right now, my pigment's quite thin, so you can see the orange through it. If you like that look, you can have it, but I think I'm going to cover the entirety. So I'm just going to go back and do another layer with that. And I'm going to jump around here for a little bit. So yet again, I'm just going to cover all of my previous applications, and then I will see you for our next step. So now that that's done and dry, we're going to switch back to the smaller round pointed brush. Again, this one is about 1/8 of an inch, and I'm going to mix more of the orange that we initially tried working with. And this will apply a lot better now that we have a slightly brighter, slightly more orange base, but I am going to make this mixture slightly more pink. So it'll be similar to what we had with just a touch of extra red. We also want it to be fairly desaturated, so I'm leaving some of it on the edge for me to test, and this is essentially what we had before. So now I'll grab some extra red, mix that in, and here you can see it in contrast with our color we previously applied. So far so good. I'm going to make it slightly brighter. I have a lot of paint here on my brush, so I'm going to take that off. Then we'll grab some of our new mixture, come into the bottom, and start wrapping this light around our clouds. And when you're building clouds and highlights and sunsets, generally the best way of going about it is starting with a darker base layer, then moving to something slightly brighter along the edges, and then continuing to do so with just a myriad of different layers and slightly different hues. So here, you can see I'm making a lot of very small strokes. The color isn't wildly different. The paint is still semi-transparent, so we are getting a bit more of a blended color than what's truly on the palette. That's important to note when you're working with acrylics. You're generally not going to get exactly what you have on your palette because your pigment is going to be semi-transparent and you're going to see the base layer and the colors from it in your mixture. So you can avoid that by just working with a lot of pigment, doing a lot of layers, or a mixture of the two. So here you can see things are starting to build. And there's a fairly thick application. It's also worth noting that the more pressure you add with your brush, the more you blend paint. And when you do that, you thin it. So if you want your pigment to be really thick like that, once you've applied it, just don't move it. Don't blend it out. Don't try to get more out of it. Just let it be exactly as it is. And grab more, move on to the next spot. I'm also jumping with my brush, and I'm leaving slight openings. I'm trying to create lots of little movements. So here you can see those are a couple little strokes like that. It makes it look like the light is wrapping around smaller portions of our cloud. Just like that. And then we'll start working this up. And the tops are, again, this more coral color, which then transitions into more of our desaturated red, which actually looks purple. Now, I like what we have here. Let's take a bit of that and let's make a brighter, more yellow mixture of it now. So I put that there just so I could monitor what this new pigment looks like beside it. It's definitely brighter. Let's make it more yellow. Let's make it slightly brighter again. Really close to what I want. Let's try that. It might be too bright. Let me just test it on my reference photo. Actually looks pretty good. Okay, so yet again, bracing my finger. And here, applying it to the very bottoms of our clouds, both big and small. And I actually have quite a bit of paint on my brush, but not too much on the tip because we were just mixing. So I'll take that off. Make my brush relatively dry because this is very yellow dominant, which means it's incredibly thin. And here you can see I'm working those edges, and then I'm working up into the greater body of the cloud, creating those sea-like strokes, which create hundreds of little bumps, which eventually, visually, equate to that of little clouds dipping down, catching light. See that? Now, we're almost out of that awkward stage for this part of the painting anyway, and so I'd just like to remind you yet again, it's okay. Awkward stages do happen. Some of you might find that you do this and you're still in that awkward phase. It's okay. Just keep doing more layers, keep adjusting. More detail, more diversity. You will get there. The only thing that's really going to stop you is the fear of failure. So be brave and enjoy the process. I feel like for years now I've been building the kind of saying of the channel to be stay creative. Stay creative painting with Ryan O'Rourke. But the more I do this, the more I feel there should be a greater emphasis on just enjoying the process. And I kind of like that as a secondary little thing to note frequently, just because I think it's so important when you're painting. You should be enjoying yourself. You should be having fun. And if you find that you're getting stressed a lot or that you're getting worried, recognize that it's happening, and that, again, if you keep painting, it'll all be okay. Awkward phases will happen. Remember to enjoy yourself. Remember, it's supposed to be a relaxed, enjoyable pastime. And don't let the base layers hinder that experience for you. So far, so good. Really liking what we're accomplishing here. And then these, we will place this at the bottom, and we'll just move it slightly up. So I'm still doing those C shapes, but now I'm doing it in this direction. And we don't really have any orange there, so I'm not going to do too much with that, and that might actually be the end of our yellow. For the most part. We'll do slight touch-ups with it, but here I'm just interjecting some of the orange that we used before, just to kind of soften that transition. And then I'll also use that orange here on these clouds to a point. Like that. But at this point we are fairly far away from that light and that yellow. So as we get higher up, we are going to let those brighter colors essentially dissipate and move more into the oranges and the corals. There we go. With that said, once this starts to dry, you can go back in, thicken your layers, and make application sharper, more yellow, more bright, really whatever you'd like to do down there. So here we have a bit of a wider shot of our sky, and I wanted to paint from a distance, so I'm going to hold my brush at the end of it like this, and I'm going to paint from an afar. And I'm doing this with that brighter orangey coral color because this is going to make my strokes significantly more loose than what they would have been otherwise, which is always great when painting clouds because it kind of eliminates the innate repetition we kind of subconsciously interject into our applications. Because without thinking about it, generally we fall back on the same patterns, the same motions with our brush, and when you hold your brush like a pencil, you're comfortable and you can kind of do that with ease. But when you're holding your brush like this, you have to be very cognizant of each little mark you're making, and on top of that, you have slightly less control. Generally, you can ground your hand if you're close to the canvas, but because we aren't, we need to be much more aware. We have this slight shake, we have this slight uncertainty in our stroke, and that's actually incredibly useful in these scenarios because it's going to make for different applications. It's going to change our painting. Also, by painting from farther away like this, we also get to see the canvas as a whole rather than specific areas, which can be an issue. And let me elaborate on that for a second. Generally, when we're working on an area and we're painting holding the brush like this, we're probably very close to the canvas and we're focusing on detail. We're trying to make that area look as good as it can. And we generally do a lot of work. We make that area fantastic, but we forget to look at it in context with the rest of the painting. And sometimes it just doesn't fit. So you either have to end up changing the entirety of the painting or something you really loved. By painting from a distance like this, you get to see all of it evolve at once, and you don't get hyper-focused on one spot, so things naturally just progress together rather than in individual little pieces. So it works better as a cohesive unit in the end. Here you can see that I'm making a series of taps. Generally, if I'm working on clouds this way, it's like that. If I'm working on clouds over here, they're moving in that direction. And my brush is kind of working like a clock. So here, coming up, finding this cloud, it's essentially going to get all of these strokes. And I'm trying to leave in the brush strokes. I'm not blending all of this perfectly. I'm trying to keep it a bit more loose. And all of these brush strokes are going to create detail. They're going to create little clouds. They're going to create subtle, slight changes and highlights. And that's exactly what we want. Also, friendly reminder, don't apply a lot of pressure with your brush, or that pigment will smear. You won't get the color you want, and you'll get a much larger application. Going to take some of this and work it back down into here. Just make sure it's nice and cohesive. Blend that up into the more purple cloud. Just like that. We can also remix slightly more yellow. That was very red. Titanium white. Essentially get the pigment that we had before. And find different areas in this to reapply it. Again, we don't want too much, and we want it to lessen as we move higher up, but adding slightly more diversity to these colors won't be a bad thing. But again, this is something I do from afar, that way you can see how it's progressing the right way. So So I'm probably going to spend another 25 minutes just adjusting these clouds in one way or another. Really doing more of the same though. And then once that's done, we'll hop into the rest of the sky together. So, as you can see, I probably spent another 20 minutes on the clouds. I added some extra yellow and light highlights down at the bottom, and I also brightened up some areas over here with mixtures that had slightly less saturation and slightly more titanium white, and I'm actually really happy with how that turned out. Now, we're not fully done with the clouds. I do want to play with these quite a bit, and the smaller ones. However, I also want a lot of those smaller ones in this area and this area. So I'm going to pause working on those clouds for now. And what we're going to do, we're going to head up, we're going to work with some blue in our openings in the sky, and we'll just start continuing from there. Then we can go back to the clouds, and sooner rather than later, we will have a really beautiful sky, which we'll get to recreate in the reflection down below. So with that said, before we get back into that, we do need to do one thing. That one thing being cleaning our water and our brushes, because right now we have a lot of yellows, oranges, and pigments of that nature, but we want to work on blues next. So if we were to mix our Cerulean Blue in with this, in with our brushes, we get something that was quite diluted and we wouldn't get what we actually wanted. So right now, I am going to go clean my water, clean my brushes, and then we'll come back and continue working on the sky. So we now have clean water, clean brushes, and I'm going to hop back into the 1/4 inch round pointed brush. Now, I'd like to talk about color theory for a little bit here. We essentially have an orange down here on the horizon. The sky up here is blue. So I think a lot of us generally ask, well, what goes kind of in the middle? Well, what happens when two complementary colors meet? We know that complementary colors are colors that are opposite from each other on the color wheel. Talk about that a lot in my book, Acrylics for Beginners. And when you essentially have two complementary colors, blue and orange, when they're beside each other, they really make each other pop, they make each other stand out, they really emphasize one another. However, when you layer two complementary colors on top of one another, they desaturate each other immensely. So, what happens right here in the middle between blue and orange? What happens when they really mix? You generally get something much closer to a gray. So in sunset settings like this, you generally have a transition from a relatively saturated orangey red down at the bottom, and then it gets brighter into something that looks a little bit more like an orangey yellow, but closer to white, and then you have this whitish gray, and then that gray transitions into a blue. So the yellow and the blue never actually touch. Instead, you get a warmish gray in between. So that's what we're going to start with here. Now I'm going to take this brush, we are going to take some white, find a clean spot here on our palette, grab just the smallest hint of Mars Black, we don't want much at all, and a hint of our blue. Just like that. You can also take a hint of your orange, so red and yellow. Just mix that orange right up here. Then I will work the majority of it off the brush. Then I'll put a little bit in this. And now we have a gray. Something that fits really well right in between both of these. Now this is a little bit dark right now, so I am going to work more white into it. And we're probably going to want to do a couple layers here. But we want to keep the top application of this very sharp because the bottom of the cloud should look very sharp. And then this area can actually be a bit more loose. You can work down, you can make it semi-transparent, you can use your finger to do a bit of a blend. Just like that. And you can start using this pigment up in areas like this, but you really should start changing the pigment a little bit. So now what we're going to do, we're going to take a hint more blue. And we're getting farther away from the light, so we can use more Mars Black. And we can start incorporating this. Just like that. And again, the top should be sharp, the bottom can be much more soft and loose. We can start incorporating that here as well. Remember not to apply too much pressure. You do want these layers to be nice and thick. You really don't want any purple showing through. That is important. There we go. And now as we get higher up, yet again, more blue, more black. That'll probably be a bit excessive, so we will add some extra white. But here you can see it does progressively get darker. And here we'll start along the edges of our clouds, recognizing that we can do a little bit of a blend here. And you can always go back with that dark red that looks purple and create a smooth blend if you want one. It's really up to you. This is something you're going to want to do a couple layers of. Just make sure it's nice and thick. And as you can tell, another thing I talk about in each lesson is that I rarely like to mix a lot of pigment initially. I like to make small amounts a number of times because it essentially forces me to figure out how I made that color the first time, so I retain it better, and that way the next time I'm doing a painting with a similar color, I want something to that effect, I know how to do it because I've done it multiple times. I have that practice. I put effort into retaining it, into remixing it, and that just makes a big, big difference. Occasionally, when we have to use a massive amount and I feel like I've missed it 4 or 5 times, then at that point, yes, I may mix a lot more, but initially not so much. Here I am at that 4th to 5th mixture, so I am mixing more. And I'm just going to fill this in. And I'm going to go back over and do this a couple of times. And those two. Then yet again, we'll continue together with more of the detailed stuff. So now that we have the blue of our sky fully filled in, I'm going to switch back to the 1/8 inch round pointed brush, and I'm going to go back to mixing the same purples that we had right there. So I know that we need quite a lot of red, I know that we need some Mars black, and we need some titanium white. Still interesting to call this purple, despite the fact that we aren't actually really using blue to mix it. Occasionally we might throw in a little bit, but for the most part it's really just a darker, desaturated red. It's always neat how that happens. But once I have this, I'm essentially going to head back up to the top here, and you can do this while the blue is wet, you can do this while the blue is dry, but I'm essentially going to paint in additional clouds, and they're going to be very small for the most part, just little pieces of them. I'm just looking over at the reference photo saying, okay, you know what, there's one here, so I'll apply that like that. And of course you can test this pigment in the other areas of your clouds to make sure that it is cohesive. That is important. But again, I'm going to kind of look down here and I'm going to work my brush like a clock as I implement these new applications. When I do create clusters or larger ones, I will leave little openings like that. Create some extra detail, some extra depth. And these, for the most part, should have fairly similar edges in terms of application. If you decide to go with a sharper application, keep all edges sharp. If you decide to go with a bit more of a loose application, keep all of the edges a little bit more translucent and loose. And you can also have different types of clouds in that some of them can be sharp like these, some of them can be more soft like this. So I am going over the edges of this one and I'm just doing more blending. I'm also creating some nice little tails on these to create some additional leading lines that draw the eye back towards the center of the painting and just aid the composition. that'll help bring the viewer in and keep the viewer invested for a longer period of time, subconsciously. So far, I really like what we have here, and I think it just gets better and better. Now, I don't know that I'm going to do as many clouds as what's presented in the reference photo. It's important to note that a reference photo is there to give you additional ideas, to make sure that your perspective and things like that are there, to incorporate things that you innately wouldn't have think of. That way, things are consistently diverse and realistic. But what it's not there to do is kind of handcuff you. And if you want to take artistic liberties, if you want to make some changes, you are more than welcome to do that. So I'm going to do that here in that I'm actually not going to have as many clouds. And here I'm just taking that same purple. I'm working it along the top edge of these larger ones. I'm working in a rounded stroke, and I'm just creating this slightly blended edge by applying a lot of pressure with my brush and moving that pigment out. Just gives it a bit more of a soft look. So with that, we'll just grab a bit more here. And I think I'm quite happy with what we've achieved. So now we're going to mix a bit more of the coral orange. And this is something you might want to be careful with, because we do have blue water right now. And if you're mixing yellow into blue, you do get green. So at this point, you have the option of going and cleaning your water and making sure that there is no risk of green, or you can proceed as I am and kind of just see what happens. Admittedly, you'll probably find the best results if you go and clean the water, but I do want to show you that you don't have to clean it every time, that it can be an intuitive process. Sometimes it doesn't have an effect, and I think we're in one of those lucky situations here where I did guess right, and there wasn't enough blue in the water and in the brush to have a real effect on what we're currently doing here. But just recognize, generally, if you have a very blue brush or very blue water, and you want to work with yellows or oranges, you can mitigate some potential issues by simply going and cleaning that up. Also, be careful with this orange. You only want to apply it atop your dark reds, because if you apply it over your blues, you may also get a green. Just using the edge of the brush, not applying much pressure at all. And we are going to have to go back and do a number of layers, because, of course, the pigment we are currently working with is rather transparent. Here I'm not applying the orange to the entirety of this cloud, it's just a portion. The orange on these clouds is essentially at the bottom, and as you can see, as you work up, it dissipates. Just something to consider. I guess it's also worth noting that you can move the orange atop the blue, and I did do that in a couple of areas, but only when I had a lot of paint on my brush, and I knew that it wasn't going to be semi-transparent. Because if you can apply it and make it fully opaque, then you're in luck, and you're not going to get that green because the blue won't show through the portions of the yellow mixture. However, do be careful with it. And if you're going to attempt it, just make sure you have enough paint. If you don't, of course, it's not the end of the world. You can just go back and add more paint. But I guess that's also an important thing to note. We are working with acrylics. They are incredibly forgiving, and that's a wonderful thing. If you mess up, that's okay. You just wait 10 minutes, let it dry, and then you can come back in and make it fantastic again. So here I'm now just going in with a slightly brighter, slightly more yellow mixture. And so we did the same process as what we did in the bottom, in that we started with the darker dark red base layer, and then we moved to more of an orange, and then we moved to more of a yellow orange. But I'm being very sparing with the yellow orange, because of course we want that predominantly at the bottom of the painting. Now, as I step back, I realized that I added slightly more clouds right here in the middle than I wanted to, so I just remixed the blue that we used initially at the top of the canvas, and I'm just going over some of those clouds. And I wanted to incorporate this in the episode because I wanted to show you that it's okay if you do overdo the clouds. Don't be afraid of adding too much paint or too much detail. You can always work it backwards. And here, as you can see, I'm holding the end of the brush so that I do get a bit more of a loose stroke. That way the clouds that are left still look really nice. Now I'm going to add slightly more titanium white, brighten that up just a hint, and that'll allow me to continue working downwards. Because remember, we do have a gradient. It's more of a gray blue here, and then we get up to a darker blue right up here. So I'm just taking out a couple of them. I'm doing it slowly, trying to make sure that the ones that are left are always original and different. And, you know, we'll just make sure the sky looks as good as we can possibly make it. But with that said, I like to say this in every episode, and honestly I'd like to say it more than once in every episode, but I'd like to say a big thank you to our patrons, everyone who supports the channel, everybody who's made it this far. Really wouldn't be able to do it without you. It is because of the support up over on Patreon that we are able to make these really long, really detailed lessons each and every week. And honestly, if it wasn't for all of you supporting the channel, we might get one of these every month. They take quite a bit of time, not only to paint, but to kind of prepare, to figure out the mixes beforehand, to draw the traceables, to do kind of all of that. So really, really big thank you to everyone up over on Patreon who is supporting the channel. This channel is primarily fan funded, and I'd like to say a really big thank you. By doing that, you ensure that I get to teach painting for a living, which is honestly just such a pleasure. You provide these lessons for everybody else who can't necessarily afford classical art training, and for yourself, and hopefully you also enjoy all of the perks and the bonuses up over on Patreon, like that of the traceables and the reference photos. But I know I say it in every episode. I know that if you watch all of these, you might get a little tired of hearing it, but I think it's so important to say thank you to the people who do facilitate these lessons and produce them and make it possible. So really big thank you to everyone who does support the channel up over on Patreon. It is because of you that we are able to do these incredibly detailed, longer lessons. Also, I know that we have a lot of new people on the channel from the latest fire painting. So in case you're wondering, we do have a Patreon. Up there I do offer things like the traceables, the reference photos. We have an exclusive Facebook group where we all kind of share artwork and help each other out. I do personalized art reviews at some of the higher tiers. And we also have a back catalog of a lot of exclusive lessons, which you can't find anywhere else. So there's a lot of really neat things up there over on Patreon. On top of that, you can also get all 5 of my ebooks, including Acrylics for Beginners, which is essentially on the essentials. Everything you need to know about acrylic painting before you jump into your first acrylic painting. In it we talk about blending, glazing, composition, how complementary colors work, the color wheel, really, again, just everything you need to know. And you can get that individually up over on Etsy, but you can also get it over on Patreon along with 3 books full of traceables for those uninspired days, and I also have another book up there. So if you're interested in any of that, go check it out. There's a link in the description. And you know, on top of all of that, it does support the channel. It means that we get to continuously make these, and I'd like to say a big thank you to everyone who has supported the channel in the past, everybody who has signed up recently. It's been really exciting to watch this grow, to watch the community grow, and I really enjoy talking to everybody over on the Facebook group. So thank you so much for taking the time to support the channel. It means more than you know. And again, I really hope you enjoy things like the reference photos and the traceables. I feel like it's probably incredibly useful on this. I know that I am consistently going back and checking colors. Painting directly on the reference photos is something I find incredibly useful. I don't think it's necessary. For a long time I actually didn't use them, but I felt like my color mixing skills got so much better once I started painting directly on the photos that I would print off. Just something to consider. But with that said, I really love the sky as it is. So next, what we're going to do, we are going to move into this rock and this rock right here. Now, as we move on to the rocks, we are going to switch to a damp 1-inch flat-headed brush. And I'm going to use this because the sharp edge will help me cut along these edges, and it can hold a lot of paint. Now, I'm going to start by making a very dark base layer, and I'll do that on a new spot here on my palette. Start with some red, grab quite a bit of Mars black, hint of titanium white, and also a little bit of our yellow. The red and the yellow are going to make an orange, but when it's made this dark and when it has quite a bit of Mars black and white in it, it actually starts to look a bit more like a brown, like a very dark shadowy color for a rock. And a warmer one at that. So this is exactly what we want. I'm just playing with it a couple of times. We do want it to be really quite dark, but we also don't want it to be a pure black. So I'm just slowly re-interjecting hints of color, hints of white, until we get something just like that. Now, when I jump back into this, I'm going to start along my edges, as you can see, like this. And I'm going to be using the corner of the brush to deliver the most sharp and small applications, and all of the little protruding rocks as well. So here you can see that we still have quite a bit of paint on our brush, and so with that paint I am just working that edge consistently, rotating my brush and my hands. So here we will just move in seemingly random patterns. I'm just kind of looking back and forth at the reference photo. That way I add little movements and inserts that I naturally wouldn't think to do. And I'm making sure, above all, that I'm not having a spot of white in between the rock and the sky. You really want to make sure that it's nice and clean, and that it looks like the rock is actually in front of the sky and not beside it with a little bit of white showing through. Here you can see just a hint of it, and that's an issue. There we go. Now that I have all of the edges, I'm just going to start filling it in. And once this is applied and dried, we can start adding some highlights, some details, and start making it look three-dimensional. I'm just going to fill in this side. I'll probably do 2 different layers, and then we'll move over to the left-hand side and put in that base layer as well. Now we're going to head over to the other side, and yet again we're going to start by cutting in along those edges with that extremely dark brown. It probably almost looks black on camera, and that's just about how dark it is, but it does have some color in it, and that's going to give it a bit of extra depth. And by having those warmer hues in there as well, it makes it cohesive with the rest of our warmer painting, so it really feels like it fits in and it builds on the atmosphere. So whenever you're thinking about painting with a pure black, consider the temperature of the painting, the atmosphere of the painting, and then interject just a hint of titanium white and a hint of whatever color will aid that scenario, and you'll get something that creates quite a bit of additional interest and just really fits within the rest of the context of the piece. So yet again, we are just working our way around these edges. It's pretty interesting how this protrudes back out. And then once that's done, we'll just paint the inside. You have a couple of options here. You can apply a lot of paint, go back, grab more, apply a lot of paint, go back, grab more, and probably do this in a single layer, or you can start stretching it out and do it in 2 layers. Really personal preference. Now, as you can see, I have both the left and the right side finished, both of which are fully dry, which we do want for our next step. And before we head on to that, I would just like to note that if you follow this edge, you'll notice that it's incredibly different from this one, and you'll also notice that this is lower than this one right here. So by simply making this lower, we make this closer to us, and it just creates a lot of additional depth. We also just want to make sure that these are nice and diverse, which is why I noted that this edging and the general shape is quite different from this one. But with that said, let's get right up close and start applying some detail. So we're going to jump back into this with the smallest round pointed brush. Again, this one is about 1/8 of an inch. We're going to grab some of our titanium white, move that right down beside our initial brown. We'll grab some Mars black, but not too much. We'll grab some red, some yellow, and we'll start creating a bit of a brighter orangey brown. So again, the only color we're not using on our palette is the Cerulean Blue. And as you can see, we already have a nice brown. So this is essentially going to work its way from the edge towards the back because the light is wrapping itself around the subject. And what's notable about what we're doing here is that we're going to have a lot of protruding rocks. So there I applied a little bit of paint, and you know what, I'll skip a little bit of space and then I'll create another one, but I'll make this one a bit higher. That way it's different, and that little space in between there is essentially a piece of rock that's inset. So here this is facing outwards, it's catching light, but that area right there, it isn't doing the same. We can create a series of these if you wanted more of a slate-like rock, and I can see a small series of them in the reference photo, and then things do start to change. So right here, this protrudes, the top of it will get more light, and then let's start moving that back a little bit. We can also make that same assertion here, and this area again is touching that. So a good common idea to follow here is that all of the edges of the rock that are going to be facing this way or facing sideways are going to have this light. Subjects that are generally facing the ground are going to have less light, so this is more shadowed, than the areas that are facing the sky. So here, yet again, even though it's not on the side, because it's facing the light, it's going to be much brighter. And I can see on the reference photo that this actually moves inwards quite a bit. So I will do that. I also noticed that we have a bit of a protruding rock right there. And so you don't just have to work in vertical strokes, you can also create different shapes. And that's what's really going to make this interesting in the end. Now, much like our applications before, we are working on top of a darker backdrop, which means this pigment is going to look darker on the canvas than it is on our palette. And that can be changed by just going over those same areas a couple of times. Now, once we start moving in here, it's worth noting that things are going to slightly get darker as you move this way, even if they are facing that side, because we are physically moving farther away from the light. So here I might apply some pigment, and I'll almost let that paint run out on my brush because it'll become more and more transparent as it does. All you have to watch out for here is that you can still get a sharp application, but you essentially just want it dissipating. Now I am going to deviate from the reference photo here because quite honestly it is a massive amount of detail, and if you wanted to paint all of it you'd probably have to commit 6 or 8 hours. So I'm not going to do all of the detail, but I'm going to get the main ideas from the rock here. So this is another rock, it's protruding, moves out here, this is the side that faces the light, this is the back so it's darker, and then it kind of gets lost in between this rock back here, and you know what, maybe we can create another one like this. Now you can also make this rock look like it's protruding by taking the top of it, moving a little bit of highlight back, that way it looks like this area at the top is getting light, this area on the side of it is getting light, and now it has this nice backing. I'm going to move this one up so that it doesn't look like this ends here and then this starts and then this starts at that same plane. So I'm just trying to add some diversity by making sure that they don't start and stop all in the same spot. We have a couple that start and stop in a similar spot over here, and I just wanted to make sure that we didn't accidentally make that something that was too consistent. There we go. Let's get you a little bit closer. So we're going to continue here with that same mixture and a damp brush. I'm bracing my hand on the canvas to create those nice, clean, sharp lines. And we have a lot of larger strokes in here, but it's important to remember that there are still lots of little rocks. So I'm just going to interject a number of these smaller, almost taps with a slight movement to them. Now it's also worth noting that we are working with a damp brush to achieve very sharp line work. However, you really don't want that to come at the cost of thin layers. So make sure that your pigment is thick enough. Of course, if you really do like to work with incredibly thin layers, you can just go back and do a second or third application. However, this is quite detailed and there's a lot of time that goes into it, so it's one of those things where you may want to purposefully work with very thick layers. That way you don't have to go back over it a myriad of times. That said, as you start to move towards the back here, having a slightly more thin pigment can actually be great because it makes it look darker, because you can see more of the black through it, or almost black rather. There we go. Again, taking the main ideas from the reference photo, but also deviating and making it my own. So we're essentially creating platforms for rocks to stand on, and then other platforms up higher to kind of compress rock and make it stay in place. Here we kind of have this little fissure happening in between, which is pretty interesting. And again, as we get towards the top here, the edge that touches the light, things should get significantly brighter. There we go. Really like how this is already turning out. Rock is definitely one of those subjects that comes really easy to some people and really hard to others. It's one of those really neat subjects that just isn't consistent from person to person. And it is a subject, if you're not great at it, you can learn over time. But it's one of those things that really does follow the general rules of how is light hitting this subject? How is light wrapping around this subject? And sometimes you're going to have rocks that are very clean in that they're going to have sharp edges. Sometimes if a rock has a lot of water consistently hitting it and a lot of erosion, it'll have a bit of a softer edge. So that's also something to consider. If you're working on rocks that are fairly high up that water just won't be touching, then you can probably go in with a really sharp edge and make it quite granular. But if you're working down close to actual water, you might want to really soften things and avoid sharp points. There we go. Really, really like this so far. But again, let's note that this area right here is significantly brighter than this area right here, that we are consistently changing patterns. A lot of our applications have a side that's facing this way, and then we generally have a little almost horizontal application that's diagonal to a slight degree that moves back to indicate either the top or the bottom of the rock. So here's one, here's one, here's one, here we have one. So they're mixed. There's another one, there's another one, there's another one. They're mixed all about, again, different angles, and you can create fissures, which are pretty neat. Now I know this is very detailed work and one might feel inclined to work extremely close to this at all points in it, but I'd actually recommend, again, much like the clouds and everything else, through sections of it, especially as you're getting towards the middle/end of it, start taking steps back, start holding your brush from farther away, start integrating those more loose strokes, and just make sure that things are cohesive, make things continuously diverse, and if you do that, you should end up with a lot of really neat different rocks that accumulate to something that looks quite natural. So here I'm just mixing up more of that brown. You can see that this is leaning currently more towards red, so I'll work some extra yellow, but not so much to the point where it completely overtakes it and we get a green with it and the Mars black. So here, holding the brush in a different way. Also worth noting, I did not wipe off my brush after mixing. That wasn't intentional, just something I forgot to do, and now I'm continuing with it to kind of show you that I'm not really able to work the edges right now. I just have too much paint on here. I'm able to work on some of these larger areas, but I'm not really going to get anything delicate done. So I'm just using this opportunity to block in, to fill in some extra areas, but also to note that I do feel less capable right now. So I will now take that extra paint off, make the brush a little bit damp, grab more of that pigment, and now I can do those nice edges. Which again, remember, above all, you do not want the almost black showing through as an edge. You want to cover that up. It's pivotal. Again, we all do it. I've noticed in one or two of my lessons when I was watching it back just to make sure it was edited properly and everything, I noticed that during one of those talks, I actually left an edge that still had that initial coloring that was a bit darker and it looked like an outline. And then after I did that, I went and I was like, okay, you know what? I better go fix the painting. So again, happens to all of us. It's very natural. Just be aware of it. Here I am throwing in some smaller little rocks. I'm making that one a bit bigger for the disruption of consistency. There we go. And remember, you want to start working backwards when you start running out of paint, because your applications like this will be significantly less noticeable. And therefore more transparent. We'll grab more paint. This area as a whole will be quite bright. So it is now our second day of working on this painting, and as you can see, I did go ahead and just finish up all of those edges. Really happy with how it's starting to look, but we are just in that beginning process because right now we have all of our different separations, we have a lot of depth in it, but what we also have is a lot of complicated detail. And something you want to watch out for in your paintings is not making every area of the painting hyper detailed, because then the eye doesn't really know where to focus. And I want to make sure that this is actually more detailed than this. So now that we have all of this detail, we're going to be able to simplify it. And I generally like to work on rocks in this way just because it allows you to really discern later on where you want that detail to be and where you want it to be simplified, and I just feel like it gives you a lot of additional option. So now we're going to take our damp round pointed brush. This is the smaller one. We are going to take some of our fresh red, fresh yellow, Mars black, and titanium white, and we'll mix that right beside our previously dried brown that we were using before. Now I want something that's relatively close to it, so I'm not going to completely mix on top of it. I do have a bit over there to the edge, and this looks like a good answer to it. So we'll try this, and I'm going to start combining some of these rock structures, especially right here at the front. I'm going to still leave little openings, and I think this mixture right now is a little bit more green than the warmer purplish orange that we have here initially. So I'm just taking portions of it, I'm moving it into different rocks in different areas. That way it's a cohesive color throughout the painting. And very soon we're going to mix back into a different hue. But this way we have some additional diversity. Here you can see that I'm just taking previously applied rocks and I'm saying, okay, you know what, we'll connect those two right here. And we'll connect these two right here. And we'll add another one right here. And we'll take out that dark spot right there. We'll do that again right there. You can see that the slightly more green mixture is adding some extra depth. You can see that the simplification is making this stand out more, and this actually looks brighter now because we don't have the same level of darkness that we did in it before. Again, I'm predominantly working on the edges here and just lightening things up. Now it looks like a pathway, which is quite nice. I'm starting to run out of paint, which means my applications are semi-transparent, and I can kind of start to move back over here to the right. And I really like that at this point, so we're going to get a little bit closer. We'll mix up a slightly warmer mixture, and then we'll build some extra depth to it. So now we're nice and close. Here we have the mixture we were just working with. I will mix right beside it, and I'll use a hint of it just to get us started. Start with more red and yellow, titanium white, and Mars black. And this time I actually want my mixture to be slightly brighter, as well as slightly warmer. So here I can see that this is definitely a more reddish orange heavy mix, and we'll add some extra titanium white to brighten it up. Now of course I do have a lot of pigment on my brush, so I'll wipe that off, make sure it's nice and damp, go back, grab this, work on those edges, and here I'm going to do a slight tap, missing little areas. That way we have slight openings and divots, but they're not dramatic openings and divots like what we had here, 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 and all of that. We want a variety of changes, and that's exactly what this is going to provide for us. So we don't want things to be all done in those really dark crevices or all done in these really light crevices. We want a mixture of the two, and that's what's really going to sell this as a subject. So here we are incorporating much more detail by interjecting all of these extra strokes and colors. However, they are so much more subtle because there isn't as much of a value change as here and here, so it isn't as noticeable, and therefore it doesn't stand out or steal the attention from this like it initially did when it had those high value contrasts. So, as you can see, now that we take a couple of steps back and we look at all of those different colors and markings, now it looks like a significantly more solid rock that still has a good amount of detail, but not so much to the point that it really takes away from the sight of that. We might go ahead and darken this edge around the end of the lesson just with a wash, but for now I'm quite happy with it, and we're going to jump into this one. So here we're going to follow a lot of the similar rules that we used in the other. So we'll use initially a fairly generic brown that does lend itself more to the orange side of things. We'll start this time, however, on the right-hand side of our rocks, and we'll move inwards as we start to run out of paint. We'll start by creating those harsher contrasts. So here, as you can see, it's light and then dark, light and then dark. Just like that. And this will give you a lot of practice, so in the future when you want to do rocks and you need to build your layers, you can always say, hey, you know what, I did it that time and I did it a lot, so I probably remember it. And you can go into that feeling pretty confident. So this is a great subject, not only to create a really nice painting here, but I think to really instill the ideas that create great rocks for the future. Now, of course, as I noted initially, we really want to avoid having any of the almost black show through on the edge. So I'm working really hard to work over that. And I'm also doing this fully cognizant of the fact that this is going to be semi-transparent. These highlights are not going to look like these yet. This is something I'm going to have to build up to. And that's okay. Going over areas once they've dried a little bit. A second time. And I noticed on the reference photo that there is an area that's kind of inset here. It moves back, but it actually receives quite a bit of light. So I'm just painting that in right now with some of the notable rocks. Again, we're leaving darker areas to begin with, but we will fill those in a little bit later. Now this one does get fairly dark fairly quickly back here. But what's neat is it has these diagonal rocks that kind of act as leading lines, move you up into that sunset. Now the majority of the edges are going to be hit with highlight. There are going to be a couple of exceptions, so do make sure that you're not just kind of outlining it. Think about where light is going to hit more, think about where it's not. Again, if you'd like to, you can check the reference photo. Whatever is easiest. Whatever you find the most rewarding as well. The most cathartic. Okay, so taking that extra paint off my brush, grabbing more of our pigment, Grounding my hand with my pinky. Heading up here because this area is going to be quite nice. Also remember you can take artistic liberties. I think that's important to note frequently. Okay, this will be a larger rock as a whole eventually, but I'm just adding in the areas that I feel like are going to have the most highlight for now. And then there's another area that protrudes there and catches light. This rock is fairly interesting. We have a lot going on. A lot of different shapes. This will be a rock. Connect that there. And you can see that the more we do, the more it starts to come together. Does take some time. Does look abstract for a little while. But that's okay. And as we get farther back, remember things get darker. So I am running out of paint, and this is a great time to do so. Now I'm going to make things a little bit less bright, right up here near the top, because I do want to create a slight vignette effect. And we do that just to draw the eye in towards the center of the painting. The eye innately goes to the brightest point of any piece. And so by keeping all of the corners just a little bit darker and the middle or near middle a bit brighter, you again just kind of subconsciously move the viewer's eye to where you want it to be. So this is more transparent paint, just have more water in the mixture, so my applications look a bit less prevalent. But again, first layer, leaving lots of openings. And going over the ones that I really like a couple of times. I'm just going to go ahead and fill in the back and the rest of this. I'll show you what it looks like, and then we'll proceed to our next layer. And I know that this might seem a little repetitive, considering we just did the rocks, but that's kind of the point. I think it's important to be repetitive in these lessons. That way information is retained, that way you try things multiple times, that way you get to experiment, that way, you know, if you are really paying attention to one aspect, you know what, here's a second chance to really pick up on something else you might have missed. I know that when I'm watching YouTube videos and I'm trying to learn, I probably watch something I'm really interested in 3 or 4 times. And I know that might be a little unreasonable with a painting lesson that's this long, but that's why I do try to repeat myself a couple of times. That way you do retain it without having to rewatch this over and over again. But I am a big fan of repetition and learning through it. I think that it's very useful. I know that it is for me. And I hope that by doing the rocks a couple of times together, it's something that can really stick for you. So now, as you can see, I have the left-hand side here all blocked in, and we can start working on combining some of these and making them detailed. But I just wanted to show you this shot so you could see this in comparison with this. And kind of what we turn it into. Here you can see we don't have as much color, we don't have as much light, and it's also, I think, visually a bit more complicated and a bit more visually stark. So let's get a little bit closer and convert this more into this. So now what we're going to do, we're going to head back to mixing more of our browns. However, this time we're going to use more green, less red, and more Mars black. I said use more green. We're going to make more green using more yellow, because yellow and black are really the key to making that more mossy color. So here, as you can see, we have something that's right in between the oranges and the greens. I'll just test it on the other side. We'll get some extra yellow. We'll get some extra Mars black. We'll brighten it up. And that definitely looks significantly more green. Now I have a lot on my brush, so I'll take that off. grab just a little bit, brace my hand, work that in a couple of areas and just make sure that A, it's a brighter value than what we've been working with, and B, that it does look a bit more green. And I feel like it does both of which quite well right now. So I'm going to start by just interjecting some smaller little taps here and there. We need to move it all about, that way it's cohesive. I might even put it right behind some of our highlights, because the real highlights are going to be more orange and these are kind of middle values. You can see that it's already starting to evolve. Okay, really good start there. I like this a lot. Now, we'll interject some extra red, a little bit more yellow, more titanium white, and we'll make something more orange this time. Just like so. If you find that it's too orange, just take a hint of Mars Black. That'll make it significantly more gray. Now we'll try this. And again, every time we do this, we are taking out slightly more of those really dark contrasted areas. And then we are replacing them with these little taps that connect all of our rocks. We are leaving some slight little openings, but we are decreasing the amount significantly, and we are combining different little layers and sheets. Might leave that one as more prominent. In the process here, because we are adding a lot of paint, it's also worth noting that we might get rid of a lot of the green we just applied. That's okay, we can always go back and reapply it. It's really meant to be a process of back and forth. And this is something you could honestly spend just hours upon hours doing. Because I'm teaching a lesson, and I don't want you to have to watch me paint rocks for 6 or 7 hours, I am going to go about this at a slightly more quick pace. And I'm not going to interject all of the extra colors I could, but you can also throw in blues, additional greens, yellows, really everything. You can complicate this to such an extent in hue, as long as you're simplifying it in value. And value, again, just refers to how dark or light something is, and hue refers to the actual color. You can see that I've switched how I'm holding my brush, and that is just so I can be a bit more loose at this point, so I don't continuously make the same strokes or movements or applications over and over again. There we go. Remember to do these areas, but when you do, make your pigment darker, because you are moving farther back, farther away from that light. So you do want additional colors. You do want to still blend and match these structures and these pieces, but you don't want it to be as bright. So we are still looking to simplify the left-hand side here, but I'm doing so with much more muted values and hues. So as you move to the left, you're essentially simplifying to a greater degree. Now, as you can see, this and this are starting to look a little bit different. I feel like this one is going to be a bit darker, just angle-wise. This is more opening, which means more light's going to get it. This really is more of the back. So your colors are going to be a bit more cool. They're going to be a bit more muted. And that's okay. What we will do, though, quickly, is we'll just build a slightly brighter version of our brown. So red, yellow, white. Let's do a lot more white. Let's do a little bit more red. Let's do a little bit more yellow. You can tell that I'm not using any additional Mars black in this. We have a little bit on our brush. We have some on our palette that we're mixing with. I do have too much paint on my brush. But what we have already there is going to be enough to facilitate what we want to do. Now, the reference photo doesn't show any values of this brightness, any saturations like this, but I just think it'll be really cohesive with the sky. It'll look nice if we do interject a slight bit of this additional orange into the edge of our rock, and we want it to dissipate quickly because, again, not much of this rock is going to get real light. It's going to be reflected light, which is going to be darker, which is just not going to be as pure and orange. So I'm not doing too much of this, but I think it's something that's really, really nice and just a great touch. You can also throw this on the other side to make it cohesive. Like this one a lot. Happened upon a really nice color. And in the process, we can simplify more. So now that we have a good base in for our rocks, we're actually going to move down in the painting and just paint in very roughly all of the smaller rocks that we have down on the shore. We are going to be painting around them quite a lot, so we don't want to incorporate a lot of detail right now, otherwise we'll probably end up painting over them to a point and then having to redo it. So we just kind of want to mark their place. So let's head down, get a little bit closer, and continue with our rocks. So right now we're going to switch to a new brush. This is a 1/4 inch flat-headed brush, and I'm going to use it because it can hold quite a bit of paint and it has nice sharp corners for our edges on our rocks. Now I'm going to begin here very simply by taking a pure Mars black and working that over the rocks that we have here in the foreground. Now, again, when you want a final layer, when you want a good base layer, I would heavily advise working in a little bit of blue, red, green, pink, purple, really anything, into your darker shadow colors, and we're going to do that later on. This right here is just a marker of where our rock should be, so later on we don't have to redraw them or find them. So I'm just going to paint this in nice and quickly with a pure Mars black for later. And we have quite a number of these smaller rocks. It's imperative that through this process we are diversifying them, making sure that they are nice and interesting. There we go. We'll lead this one off the edge. That way we can see a little bit of water in there. That'll be a neat effect. Then we have another rock right down here. It's a bit smaller. I'd also recommend initially painting these rocks slightly smaller than what you think they should actually be, because later on when we're adding our highlights and our proper base layer, we'll probably end up expanding it and changing the shape in one way or another, and it's a lot easier to add volume and size than it is to subtract it. So generally, when you're painting trees, rocks, just about anything, paint it slightly smaller initially. That way you have the easy option of going in and making it larger. And you don't kind of have to fight the process of making it smaller. And the reason for all of that is generally, when you're making something bigger, you're just adding paint on the edges, covering up previous applications, because hypothetically it is in front of your previously applied subjects. where if you need to make it smaller, you essentially need to repaint the background around your subject, and that can be quite tedious as you have to work with a lot of different colors and applications. So right now, we're just working our way around. I do have a bit of water on my brush, but not too much. The idea here is that I want enough water to create sharp edges to get these on in a relatively quick fashion, but not so much water that my applications are semi-transparent. And I don't want them to be semi-transparent because then if I paint over them slightly, I will lose them. And that kind of defeats the purpose of what we're doing here right now. There we go. Also notice I'm not trying to give them all flat bottoms. We are consistently trying to change that, make them more diverse, make them more interesting. Here I'm going to have a large number of rocks to the point where they essentially overlap visually. So I'm just creating a myriad of smaller shapes like that of rocks, and I'm applying them on top of one another. Now I know when a lot of people are beginning, this can be kind of an intimidating process because you don't want to make things confusing and you don't want to hinder work that you've done by covering it up, but it really is the best way of going about this. Rather my favorite. And we have one more. Again, not a flat bottom, kind of jets out and then moves back in. Just going to go touch up a couple of these, make them more interesting, and then we can proceed to painting some water. But before we do that, make sure that all of these rocks are dry. That way you don't accidentally grab some of the Mars Black and interject it into the water. And after this, we're also going to go clean our brushes in water because we're going to start working with some different colors. Like that a lot though. Now we're going to switch back to our 1/4 inch round pointed brush. We'll grab some of our Mars Black, a little bit of Titanium White. We'll grab some Cerulean Blue and about an equal amount of our Cadmium Red Light Hue. We're going to make what looks like a bit of a darker purple. Just like that. Now I'm going to take this, using the sharp edge of my brush, I'll create the horizon line, but as I'm quickly finding, I simply have too much paint on my brush to do that effectively. So I'll take that off, go back and grab more. Really trying to put a heavy focus on that idea in this episode, just because I do feel like it's something that's neglected from time to time, but quite important. So I'm just working with a myriad of strokes rather than trying to do a single long stroke. It's generally an easier way to get things consistent and without a real curve. And then from there I'll start moving down around my rocks and I'll work down into the mid-ground of our water. As you can see, this is quite watery though, very transparent. And that means we need significantly more thick paint and less water. So I will build up the amount of paint I have here on my palette. And I won't add any additional water to my brush, but I will take off that extra paint I just moved about. Now when we apply this, it's going to be more thick, but it's also going to work with the water that we currently have on the canvas, so it's not going to be perfectly thick at this point. It's still going to be semi-transparent. That's okay. We're just building it up. And of course, in this process, we do have an opportunity to make changes, to adjust colors or values if we'd like to. A lot of opportunity at this point. Now, once we get to this point, I'm going to make a significantly brighter variant. So I'll mix that right beside. I'll even grab some of what we started with. Make it a bit more red heavy. Give it a hint of yellow. And again, we'll make it a bit warmer. Getting there. Titanium white. And this is what I wanted. So as the water moves in here, it's going to hit the edges of these. It's going to create this real mist. It's going to create splashing effect and a highlight. So I'm not actually going to paint a real splashing effect. I'm just applying these right here to show you where we need this. And then I'm going to start blending it out, working in circular strokes from that point of impact. And they are going to blend to a point, that's okay. Going to work this up here. All of that extra titanium white will actually really aid this in thickening the application here. Just being very careful of my edges. And then I'll move this down here into the water. And right here, again, that water is going to be moving right around there, so I'll do a bit of a blend upwards. The same can be said for right here. So a little bit of a blend with a circular stroke. Let's make it a bit brighter. Grab some titanium white. Start that here. And we're just going to build this up slowly over time. We're also going to have a lot of this right down here. And a good way to kind of visually gauge this is at the bottom of this rock, this is at the bottom of this rock, this is at the bottom of this rock. And now I'm going to go back, do a little bit of a rounded stroke, just make sure there's some movement there. Make sure that it's dissipating as it's moving up. I'll blend it here into the rest of the water. And then I'll blend it slightly down into this darker area. Speaking of which, we will need some of that darker pigment, so we'll grab some Mars Black, some Cad Red, a little bit of primary yellow, titanium white, more titanium white. Again, just looking for a darker version of this. And this looks like it might be it. It's quite gray, which I do appreciate. I'll try it back here. I like that. And I am progressively making this brighter as we go along. It's one of those things where I applied it and I thought, you know what, this could be a little bit brighter. And then I thought, you know what, it could be a little bit brighter. And then I continued having that thought. Now our water here is really moving. We're getting a lot of splashing, we're getting a lot of different effects happening. And so it's not going to look like we'd innately think of water. So here I'm just going off the reference photo in terms of pattern and stroke. Right back here it's going to be a bit darker. It's also worth noting that our water here isn't blue, but it's more of this purple reddish pigment. And we're using what we are here because water, the color of it, is essentially a reflection of that which is in the sky. And as you can tell, the sky has a lot of reds and purples and pinks. So this is what we're using. Just cleaning my brush. Going to grab more of our actual highlight. I'll work that here now. I'll work that around to this rock. Move that out a little bit. Start connecting these two. Soften that. You can soften it up the rock, but we'll have to go back and do that anyway because we still have to paint the actual rock. Let's do some of this from afar though, that way you can see how it's all progressing together. So now what we're going to do, we're going to take more of the darker pigment that we used right in there, and we're going to work that off over to the side here. We'll have it wrap itself around this rock, behind this rock, and we'll have it touch these rocks right back here. So now we have an extra level of depth, and it looks like this rock is now far in front of this one. Now what we're going to do, we're going to start moving forward with this darker pigment, and we can essentially use this as our base layer should we want to. Here you can see I'm able to work relatively roughly around our rock because it is quite dark. I can see it through that initial layer of paint. Don't really have to worry about it. And I'm using this predominantly for my edging, so the left and right hand side of the canvas, because the light's working its way through the middle. And so we're going to get the brightest reflections, the most light, in the middle, while these areas have more shadow from the rocks. And I think we might actually make this a little bit darker, so I will interject some extra Mars black into it. A little bit more titanium white, which will brighten it, but gray it. And that's really nice. That's better. Just test it on the reference photo. The reference photo has a bit more of a blue to it, a bit more of a teal to it, but that's just because the sky in the reference photo actually replaced with a different sky. So I am adjusting this slightly to be a bit more pink. I will Photoshop it for the final reference photo that you all use, but right now mine looks a little bit more blue. It's okay, I know that this color is what's cohesive with the piece. There we go. Now it looks like we have a dark patch right here, and then it gets brighter right here, and then it gets a little bit darker right here before our rocks. So we're going to have diversity in value. We're not going to have too much, but we're going to have enough that it keeps the water interesting and engaging, so that it doesn't look flat or all the same. So that it shows movement, but it doesn't become distracting. Now we are currently at one of those awkward stages. Do you recognize that? That is okay. We'll take some highlight, and we'll just start working this back and forth, little horizontal lines that occasionally dip down and up, so you get these little openings of darker and lighter applications. Grab a bit more and I'll show you significantly more on this side. So I'll apply it, and then I'll dip down into here, and then I'll move left and right, and I'm kind of working in a Z-like pattern. So we'll move down, left, right. Saying that backwards because I'm assuming the camera is flipping the view, but it may not be. I did want to go up and brighten this a little bit. We are refining. Grab some more titanium white. Brighten right under this. And then again, as we move out, move down slightly diagonally, horizontally, diagonally. Creating these little patches of dark, light, dark, light. It's a very intuitive process once you get it. Grab some more titanium white. And we'll just continue to build There's a really good example of the dark light effect. As you can see, we are really starting to lose our rocks. That makes sense though. We did foresee that, and that's why we painted that darker base layer first. Now you don't have to do that. It's worth noting that you could just paint over that area later, redraw it in, use a traceable, go back to the start of the video. You do have a number of options. Here you can see it's really starting to come together. That'll look significantly more natural once we have the rock in. Let's get you a little bit closer for the technique over here. So, yet again, I'm moving left, then I'm moving down diagonally, and then I'm moving left, and then I'm moving down diagonally, and then I'll go over to this edge and I'll kind of move that down, and I'll just connect these little pieces, these little strips that we worked back and forth. This is ideal when you're working wet into wet, but it isn't mandatory. If you just use a little bit of extra water on your brush, you can do this quite effectively with the bottom darker layer dry. There we go. And because we did do so much wet into wet, you can tell that a lot of these highlights that we worked back and forth are quite subtle, and that's why we're going back over them so many times. We're just building them up at a slow pace until we get what we actually want. So down, left, right, down, grab that corner, move it, grab that corner, move it, create another little movement there. Really, really like how this one's turning out. Feel like for a long time I really struggled with warm sunsets that involved many colors. But I've been doing a lot of them over the last year or so. And the more you do, the better you'll get at it. Really is one of those things that practice, color mixing, you know, it takes a little bit of time, but you get there. You do. There we go. Like that side a lot right now. Good. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go and I'm going to make specific color to fix that up. I feel like we've played with it a lot and it just needs a good thick layer right now. It's a bit more gray, it's a bit more purple. We have a lot of paint on our brush. There we go. That is exactly what I wanted. Nice and subtle. I also wanted to note that on areas like this, you can switch to the smaller round pointed brush. This one again is about 1/8 of an inch. I will make more of our initial really bright pigment right down here. Do a couple of different attempts and mixes. Take off the extra on my brush. Grab that. Brace my hand. Start on the edge of the rock where it's going to be most prominent. Do a slight blend down. And then from there, we can proceed in making these applications much more notable. So you see how I'm just going this way, and then I'll trail back a little bit, and then I'll move that way. but I don't want a hard edge here, so I'll move that out. And I'll move that back down into this one. The idea is that you never really have an end to any of these. They just kind of continuously sprawl out in different directions. Occasionally you can have them just dissipate, become fully transparent, like this one is. But for the most part, they're just continuously connecting, kind of creating this web. And you can blend the bottom of them down, but you want to keep the top of them a bit sharper. And that's just going to create a nice little moving water effect. Also remember, go back and make these areas the brightest highlights. If you end up making areas like this brighter, this really does need to remain the most visually prominent subject and area. So now this movement of water, this wave that's kind of coming in, this is going to end right about here, and then we're going to get a bit of reflective water, a very minimal amount going forward. So we're going to end this by just taking a bit of our darkest purple that we used here, and we can make it slightly darker because it's closer to us, and as you move closer to us in the painting, generally contrast becomes much more notable, much more heightened, because you don't have as much atmospheric reflection. So I'm just taking a darker purple. We can run it right through that rock. You can blend it slightly up into the top of your last application. Just like that. And I know it looks like I'm kind of grinding the paint into the canvas. That really isn't the idea here, and that's not something I'd ever suggest doing. What I'm doing is I'm just working in little circular strokes to get a very soft blend from this into this. There we go. And you know what, as I do that, I think I actually want to expand it down a little bit. So I'll take that darker pigment that we have, and I'll actually move it to here. Yeah, I think I'll like this better. And I'll move the highlights and everything down a bit more. So that just means doing more of what we were doing until we get to this bottom point. So I'm just going to go ahead and extend this a little bit. Not going to do anything new, not going to do anything special, just going to continue that base layer effect and then that zigzag back and forth, with this being the darkest point. And once that's done, we can continue together. So here we have another wide shot of the painting. I just extended that a little bit. As you can see, I actually opted not to add much additional detail at all. And now I'm going to go take a lunch break. Been painting for a little while now, and when we come back, rather, when I come back, for you this will probably be a 2-second break. What we're going to do is we're going to take the sky here and we're going to paint that right down in the water. Then we can start building around it, then we can go back to our rocks and do everything else we need to do. But yet again, I know I said this, I guess yesterday, but it wasn't yesterday for you. Big thank you to everyone who is supporting the channel. Big thank you to everyone who's getting this far. I think it's wonderful when people are this invested in learning and figuring things out. And I just really like to commend you for spending the time to, watch this all the way through and get everything as right as it can be. So thank you for joining me. Thank you to all of the patrons for supporting the channel so I can take multiple days to paint these things, take a day to Photoshop things and figure out all of our colors and how we're going to go about it. This is really fun, and I appreciate it. So thank you. I hope your painting is going along quite well, and we will get back to this in just a second. So now we're going to start working on our reflection. I'm going to be using the larger 1/4 inch round pointed brush, and I'm going to remix the purple that we have right there. So I'll start with some titanium white. We'll grab a little bit of our red. We'll grab some Mars black. And then we'll need significantly more titanium white yet again. Now I'm not sure which of these colors was that color or if it even still exists on the palette, but I think this will be a good first try. And I'm going to test it on our previous application, and as you can see we were actually able to mix that quite well. So once I have that pigment, I'm going to come right down here and I'm going to paint this upside down. Now you can do this by just kind of using the reference photo and actually flipping the canvas and painting it upside down like that. That is one way of going about it. Another is just doing what I'm doing here, and that's looking at it and following through with similar applications. It doesn't have to be absolutely perfect. We are going to obstruct the reflection a little bit with some moving water, but this is a good start. Now I'm going to paint the cloud that's right above it. There we go. And then we have a longer cloud over here that doesn't go out that far. It's a little bit lower. And here I'd advise moving slightly out farther than what we have drawn in with these two lines. That way we can cover up what we don't want, but we have more if we want it. Now we'll say, okay, this will take a little bit of a break and then it'll start moving up on an angle. I have some slight little bumps in there. And we should have a little bit of blue right in here. So I'll leave that out. And I'm just going to block in this with the darker reddish pink that we have up there, which is quite close to this, but I do believe it has slightly more Mars black and slightly more titanium white. So it's a bit more gray, it's a bit darker. Of course, we'll test it first up in the sky. And that was significantly too dark, so I'll just wipe that off. Grab some extra titanium white. Again, head up to just any of the areas here that are visible. Test it. It's good. It could be slightly more red. And there we have it. So this is actually the color I want for this cloud. It's a little bit darker than that. So I'm just going to fill this in. I'm probably going to do 2 different layers here. Just make sure it's nice and thick like we did with the initial cloud. But while I wait for this to dry, we will go and work on the sky right there. So I'm going to take that paint off my brush. I'm going to say, okay, the bottom's more of this orangey pink. So we'll grab some red, we'll grab some yellow, grab some white, and I'll test that. Looks quite nice. So we'll start applying that right down here, in between our purples. Now this is a reflection, so I'm going to interject some additional little horizontal strokes into our mixes to show that the water is moving up and down a little bit. And remember, once we get to this point, we do switch to a much more yellow dominant mixture. Grab a hint of what we used before. Test this in the sky. Yet again, we found the color. I'm getting really lucky, admittedly, with these. So now I'll start applying that right here. I'll blend it back into that previous color in the same way we did before. And I think I'll need to go back and brighten this just a little bit. So I'm going to take all of that pigment off my brush, grab more paint, grab a bit more of that. There we go. We only really want that nice coral red at the bottom. And as you can see, I am moving over my clouds to a point. That's okay, we can just repaint them should we want to. And I'll also make sure that it connects with this quite well. Now, from there, we will take more of that purple that we were using. We'll just fix up our clouds here. Nice and quick. You can see that there is more of a blend here. That way it looks a bit more glassy than the sky does. So the edges are a little bit softer, and we occasionally do have a horizontal stroke that moves either through the sky or through the cloud in one color or the other. Now, it's also worth noting that generally, the reflection of this would be right here, and then you'd get the tail end of the sky down here. I am taking an artistic liberty. I am instead making this start right here. Now, depending upon the angle, maybe you could see this like this in real life, but it's just not a really common thing. So recognize that I am aware of this, but I just think that the painting will look so much better for it, and I don't think it will look wrong. So with that said, very happy with that. Now let's continue there by making a slightly more orangey version of what we had. So this was the color we just used. I'll use some extra red, some extra yellow, extra titanium white, just like that. A little bit more yellow. There we go. That's really nice. And with this, we will run along the bottom of our cloud in the same way we worked up with the highlights there. So here you can see we're building the thickness. I'm letting that paint really blend and create a gradient. And then we have another one that's working from this side that goes over here. So we'll create that, and then we have another over there. Now I'll also take some of the purple that we were using for the initial base layer. I always call it purple. It's really just a very dark desaturated red. But we'll take that once I mix a little bit more. And we'll do a second layer here just to make sure it's nice and thick. And you can balance your oranges with that. Now from here, we have a couple of options. We can let this dry and then apply the details like we did before. We can continue working wet onto wet and just not have as stark of an application. But I think we can also touch things up, and I think I want to extend the sky a little bit more. So I am just going to take some yellow, white, red. You might not have to do this, but if anything, this should just be a reminder for you to frequently just take a look at your painting and say, okay, what have I done? What do I really like? What do I want to touch up? And then work from there. It can be a completely different subject from what I'm currently working on. Now, as you can see, mine did mix with the orange, with the purple. That was to be expected. They were wet. You just need a lot more paint to get over that. There we go. Finding our way. And yet again, as we get closer to this, we're going to interject more titanium white. So I'm just going to make a significantly more white mixture. Run that initially here along our edge, and then blend it back this way. As you can see, it's actually not as saturated or as bright as the top, and that's something you can choose to do because it does run the benefit of making sure that the attention goes to the real sunset and the reflection is kind of something to visually aid it. You could create a perfect reflection, it's up to you. I think I like this better as a secondary subject than the more prominent one. So from there, I am going to now head back into the other cloud, the big one. Create that edge again. There we go. And I'm essentially doing the same techniques that I used for the clouds earlier, but upside down. So I'm doing a blend with a slightly diagonal horizontal stroke to move in this way. That way it looks like the light is wrapping its way around the cloud, just upside down. So, as you can see, I went ahead and did a second layer over that and just kind of redefined my clouds while I waited for this to dry. But now that it is, we can go back with more of an orangey yellow that's kind of white, and we'll just rebuild the highlights that we previously instilled in the top. So we're doing the same techniques that we were for our clouds previously, except we're doing everything upside down. So it's a series of these cup shapes in a slightly lighter value than what we did before here. This and this connect through that series. So we can see then this one has a little bit of a dip down, and we're blending with a series of additionally cupped strokes that wrap their way back around the cloud. And remember, we want that edge to be very sharp. Now here we are going to continue. This is going to be the blue sky, so we'll use Cerulean Blue for that in a little bit. But right now we're just repainting our clouds upside down. Don't have to be perfect. Again, we are going to add obstructions, but the closer you make it, the better it will look in the end. Now going to grab some additional yellow, some additional white, mix all of that up. And the idea is that we just progressively, continuously make this mix more yellow, more bright. We give it that nice diffused gold look as it comes off the sky. And we are going to work this in a little bit. Starting to run out of paint, so I'm just going to take what I have off my brush, grab some extra water. Right now it's all looking a little dark, a little muted. It's okay, it's how it's meant to right now. Remember what we talked about earlier about building base layers? This is all part of the process. Took us a while to get the sky just right. I think it actually took us about an hour in total filming time. So don't expect for this to come super quickly. It will come quicker because you've already done it once and probably retain a fair bit of it. But this secondary application of it will definitely help you really instill it for the future to a greater degree. So there we go. Now I'm going to clean my brush, grab more titanium white, make a new mix, so I'll just grab a hint of what we were using before, like that. Come down to the bottom, and now it almost looks like this is blending into this, and that's a really, really good thing. So, it's been about 20 minutes of just refining the sky and those clouds, and I decided to skip filming all of this because it was really repetitive. I do think repetition is important, but I think after a certain point it isn't necessarily necessary. So I've been going ahead and just doing some refining, same techniques we did down here, but I thought I'd note that I flipped the canvas upside down, I'm actually finding it a lot easier to work on. I also wanted to just quickly put out there a friendly reminder that yes, we have been working on these clouds, these larger ones, but don't forget to make a very bright, nice yellow and work that back on the bottoms of some of these clouds like you did in these ones right here. So it's a quick little thing, doesn't take much time, doesn't take much extra effort, but will make a difference. I just realized that this is inverted and I was painting on the wrong side of them. Also something to consider. It's okay, we can easily go back over it with a little bit of that purple. Looks like I'll have to mix a bit more. A little bit of Mars black. A little bit of titanium white. A bit more red. Go back over that top area, and it's an easy fix. If anything, also just an opportunity to refine. Once we have the warm colors that we want reapplied, we are just going to take that larger 1/4 inch round pointed brush, take some Cerulean Blue, some titanium white, a little bit of Mars black, and with this, we are going to recreate the color for our sky. Looks good, I'll test it. And now we'll start applying that right down here, and we'll move it in the same ways that we did initially in the sky. We also have a little bit more right here, just like that. Now that one should be slightly brighter than that because it's closer to the light, so I'll take some extra titanium white, work that in there. There we go. Really nice. And if you do find that you're struggling with this part, with portions of me not showing the painting, don't worry about it. Really, all you have to do is flip the canvas upside down. And if you want a really, really detailed instruction showing, just about the entirety of it, just go back to the earlier point in the video where we did do that before and follow it from there, because really it's doing the exact same thing, just upside down. But again, if you flip the canvas, it's right side up. So it's really easy to work around if it is something you do find you have trouble with. And we already did show it as in-depth as we could. So don't worry about that. The information is there, it is in this lesson, and this is really just a copy, and it doesn't have to be perfect. We are going to obstruct it in just a minute. So with that said, let's start working on this and this. So now we're going to take our 1 inch large flat-headed brush, make sure that it's nice and damp. We'll grab some Mars black, quite a bit of red, a little bit of yellow, hint of titanium white, and we'll mix up a really nice dark brown that should be quite similar to what we had right up here. And I think mine is a little bit too red, so I'll throw some extra yellow in here, which when mixed with the black will make it look more green, which will nullify the saturation of the red, because red and green are complementary colors. Almost there. We'll give this a go, and that is much better. So now that I have this pigment right here, I'm going to actually cut in to our reflection and show some of the sand coming through it. I'm then going to do that again right here. So I'm creating a longer sharp stroke. I'm moving the brush back into this area, just like that. Then you know what? We'll do it yet again. From here. Like that. and then we can fill in this back area once we feel like we can no longer create some really sharp impressions. So now I'll grab some more water with my brush, and this is going to be a reflection of this and also the sand that we can kind of see a little bit underneath. So I'll make slightly more of my pigment. And we'll start this time right over here. I'll find that. I'll come right down, say, okay, you know what, that needs to be right here. Comes up, and then we quickly get that movement into here. We have the full edge all mapped out. And we can do another one of these lines, cutting in and obstructing the initial painting. Then once you have that the way you want, we're just going to move this all the way back to right here. We are going to be applying some really nice movements in this in just a little bit, but right now we need the base layer fully applied. Going back over it a couple times, different areas to make sure it's nice and thick. Now I'll head over to this side, mix slightly more paint, and every time I do mix slightly more paint to A, practice, but B, just to ensure that I don't end up kind of running out and then doing a lackluster job in one of these areas. Now the reflections here are a bit more subtle, and I'm actually going to kind of dance around the edge here with my brush, and by that I mean I'm just going to kind of tap out over into portions of our pre-established reflection. Like this, I'm kind of rotating the brush, but I'm essentially just using the corner of the brush. So I'm not really creating lines, I'm creating little taps. I'm just trying to make sure that those taps are different and evolving in one way or another. You could also do this with the smaller round pointed brush, but then once you have that, we're going to go to the edge, and anything that's still white, anything that's still clean canvas, we are going to move over with this larger amount of pigment. There we go. This is little portions of that breaking out, so you can also do a couple little horizontal lines like that. And you can see how it's really starting to move on top of our clouds, and that's why they didn't have to be perfect. But we also want those little dots out there as well. Now again, I'm going to move this back. And once we have these, we can start doing some more fun detail work. Now things are going to get a little bit questionable as we get to these rocks right here, because we don't want to cover them up, and we are going to have more of this pigment in this general area. So I'm actually just going to loosely work a little bit around some of these, but I'm keeping all of their form and shape intact. There we go. I know it doesn't quite look like water yet, but we will get there. Don't you worry. And we'll do that by switching to our round pointed brush. We'll get a little bit closer and we'll start working on this area together. So now we're going to make sure our round pointed brush is nice and damp. We are going to mix more of the purples that we were using before. Again, really just a dark desaturated red. So we have our red, we have our white, we have our Mars black. We'll test that just to make sure it's nice and cohesive. I think it needs to be slightly more desaturated, so we'll add a little bit more white and black. And I think we may have desaturated it a little too much, so slightly more red. Just kind of working it back and forth until we get what we actually want. And that right there is perfect. So, now what I'm going to do, I'm going to come down right in between the previously applied water and our reflection / sand. I'm going to start applying this. I'm going to start leaving openings. I'm going to let the pigment run out as I move closer to us. And it's going to make the water look more and more transparent as the paint runs out. See that? Going to move portions of this over the sky. And I'll follow these general lines that we created before as well. So, okay, I see that line. There we go. And now I'm really just letting it fully run out. Just like that. Now this side's a little bit more interesting, and we're not done that, but I do want to let it dry for a second. We'll grab more of what we were just using, and first we will connect this into our previous application. So that's nice and cohesive. Then we will fill in all of the white that we have over here on this side of the canvas. And you know, I think that might be a little bit bright, so what we'll do, we'll take some white, ironically. We need to make it darker, but we're starting with white. We'll grab some red, a little bit of Mars black, mix those together. It's definitely darker, we'll give it a try, and that's pretty perfect. Again, the more you do this, the better you'll get at it. I've found that just in this lesson, I myself got a lot better at it. Don't be afraid to do things twice, 3 times. Don't be afraid to remix your paints twice, 3 times. Again, I went back and did this 3 times, probably. Just subsequent layers, building things up, trying slightly different colors. So I'm starting by just working around those rocks. We did lose quite a bit of the sharp edging with them, but that was to be expected, and that's okay. We still know where they are because we have those dark silhouettes. And now, I'm going to do the same thing that I did over here. I'm just going to slowly let that pigment run out. I'm leaving little darker areas in between sometimes. If I feel like an area should be a little bit brighter or should be a bit more thick, I apply more pressure with my brush, and it makes things more opaque and notable. There you can see I moved it into the sky yet again. There we go. Really nice. If you feel like you make it a little bit too bright, you can also take the colors from that dark reflection and sand, and you can actually work that back if you want to. So here you can see we're kind of working in reverse. Now I'm going to switch to the smallest round pointed brush, make the color we were just working with quite a bit brighter, so extra white and red, mix that into it. That way we get something cohesive but in the right direction. I'll take the excess paint off my brush, go back, grab a little more, and then on some of these that I think should be prominent, I will just put a little bit of a wavy, incredibly small line on the edge of the water that I think will be coming up. This is where a lot of the magic in the reflection happens. There we go. Don't want to do too many, and you don't want to fully follow the line. You want this to be a little glimpse, a little shine that occurs occasionally. It's supposed to be special, not following all of it. Now things are still going to look a little messy right now because of course we still need to go back and work our rocks. We do need to add some extra detail into our water, and we actually need to add some extra detail into that. But right now, I'm just going to take a bit more of that highlight, work it along the top of this. That way I can work a bit more down here and just make this and this a bit more cohesive. Make them feel like they fit together. And you can even bring one into the other if you want. You know what, I don't like that. I say that, I'm not a big fan. Which is okay. If anything, I'm kind of glad we did that, just to show you that it's okay to do things you don't like in your paintings, because it's quite easy to just walk back. Making that darker red mixture again. Finding that edge. And we'll just recreate that. Nice and easy. We can also take that darker shadow and move that out. That was the answer. Move a bit more out. There we are. Starting to look like a nice reflection, isn't it? I know I'm getting quite happy personally. And again, I'm continuously going back over portions of this. Larger drawing, larger painting. There we go. Let's do the next step from a little bit farther away. So now we're going to take our 1-inch large flat-headed brush. We're going to look at the sand color that we had before. We're going to mix on top of it. However, this time we're going to interject more titanium white and make something just a bit brighter. I do want it to be fairly orangey brown. So I'm using quite a bit of yellow and red here. Brighten it up again. And that should be what I want. So with this, you see how we have these movements and these lines? We're going to create just a couple movements like this with the sand color. Don't need much of it. This isn't going to overlap into this, and it's going to stay on the side of the sand. Just an extra detail that actually does a lot of good. There we go. Also creates more leading lines. If you feel like you have slightly more than you want, you can just add more Mars Black and simplify. You can also blend and edge back into the sand as well. Now I'm going to switch back to the smaller round pointed brush, grab some of our titanium white, a little bit of red, a little bit of black. We'll create a real pinkish highlight that mirrors that of the highlight that we previously used in the water here. So something like this, we'll test it. That looks really good actually. So I'm just going to create some additional highlights back here. Nothing too dramatic or stark. But then once I have a couple of these established, I'm going to take the extra paint off my brush. I'm going to head back into this. We're going to head back down here. And we're just going to try to bring some of the light from there down into this area. This is a larger opening. It can be a bit brighter, but we'll let it get darker as we get to that edge, just for that vignette effect. Same goes with over here. We have some highlights, we can just brighten them. I'm just trying to take more of the pigments from up here and move them down here. That's really the whole idea behind that. The more you do here, the more it'll make this area look wet and like actual water. So it all depends on how much you actually want to do. I actually like the really dark contrast down here, so I don't want to do too much. But I'm just creating some angled little movements out here that again lead the eye in, they create detail, and they transfer more of that highlight down, making it cohesive. There we go. Like that a lot. Grab a bit more. Now we're not quite done with the water just yet, but I am going to go back to the larger flat-headed brush. I'm going to make sure it's really quite wet. I'm going to take some Mars Black. I'm going to take a hint of red, hint of yellow, and no titanium white. Then I'm going to take more water, add it to my brush, work it here on the palette, and as you can see, it's starting to get very watery to the point where it's almost like watercolors. So when we apply this, it won't be thick at all and it won't disrupt any of our previous lines. And I'm going to add a glaze to the left and right hand side of our rocks here, just to darken this a little bit to match what we have at the bottom slightly better. As you can see, because there's just so much water on the brush, I'm not affecting any of the line work, I'm just making these subjects a little bit darker. You can buy mediums for this, but I find water works quite well. I've never had an issue with it. And as you can see, it just made the piece a little bit more dramatic. You can also grab just more water on your brush and do a bit more of a gradient. You can actually peel up that dark pigment in the first couple of minutes. So if you want to play with it, if you want to kind of move it around, you can do that. You can also wipe it off with your fingers. You also don't have to do this, by the way. This is just if you want it to be a bit darker. I personally really like that darker look. I think that worked quite well, but it's up to you. And you really don't have to do it if you found that your edges were initially already very dark. Just an extra little tip, extra little technique, which I tend to use more at the end of paintings just to make things a bit more cohesive. But again, not done this one, so let's head back down into the rocks and finish those up. So now as I come back down into the rocks, I'm going to switch to the smaller round pointed brush, and I'm going to start by creating a little bit of a lighter brown. Now we have some brown already here on the canvas, so I'm just adding more titanium white to it. If I feel like it needs to be more saturated, I'll add some extra red and yellow into it, and there we have a nice green. There we have a nice orange. There we have a nice mix. And I'll apply this on the edges of the rocks, and I may recreate new edges if we've lost the previous ones. And these are all just going to be the sides that are facing, of course, the light. So I feel like this right here will be getting quite a bit of light. We kind of have a triangular rock here. This is the back of it, so that won't be receiving much, if any. But I can work that over there. Now from there, let's actually grab a bit of a darker mixture of it, and we'll clean up the back of it. Remember to give it some neat little movements, different things occurring, make it interesting, captivating. To make things cohesive, you can move this pigment over into here a little bit. Now we'll grab some extra titanium white, work that into our brighter mixture. Maybe grab some of the extra red that we decided not to use, And we'll create nice real highlight for the edges here. Just doing some little taps for detail work on the rock. Just like this. I don't want it to be too bright. I really like how stark it is. Just enough to give it some texture, make it look natural. Now, we'll take more of our mid-brown. We'll head on over in this rock. The light's coming this way, so we will add the light to the edge. As I start to move back, I will let it dissipate. I'll also skip little areas. Here we have another rock. Try to make sure that they're all different shapes and sizes. I'm kind of just lightly grazing the canvas and occasionally missing spots, and I'm letting those missed spots work as the divots and the darker interiors that just aren't going to be receiving light. So I'm just letting it happen very naturally in a cathartic way of going about it. Not worrying too much. All I'm thinking about is, okay, is the light hitting the right side? Yes. Okay, good. Is this new application slightly brighter than the last? Yes. Okay, good. Is this rock slightly different from the last? Yes. Okay, good. And if no to any of those, how do we fix it? What am I doing wrong? How can I adjust? Can't be that hard. There we go. Now, I'm not actually going to add a lot of highlight to this one because it is so far to the right, it's just not going to be receiving as much light. So I'll just add a hint of a highlight, but not as close to this or this. And you'll notice that this one actually has more than that. Now we'll go back to the darker browns for a second, and we will redefine this one. Now these aren't protruding as much. They're a little bit farther away from the light, so they're not going to catch as much light. And so we're going to keep these as a whole quite a bit darker, but we are going to go in with a slight highlight in a second. So I'm just placing these in. You can create new ones, you can create small ones. Just make sure that in the process they are different. We actually have a lot over here in the reference photo, I can see. Just kind of poking out of the water. Remember to make the edges really nice and sharp. We did move a lot of water on top of these, so make sure that the areas that were previously drawn in with the black and then covered up with the pinks and purples and reds are fully recovered yet again. There we go. So far, so good. So far, really good. Now, again, talking about highlights, we'll grab some titanium white. We'll grab a little bit of yellow, a little bit of red. It's not too much brighter, but it's a little bit brighter. And I'll just work that onto the edges and tops that are, again, going to be receiving some of that light on the horizon. You can see that I'm really jumping around a lot. I'm trying to be quite loose with my brush, trying to stay inside the rock, make sure that the edge is where the majority of the highlight is, but I'm also just letting there be little openings and natural effects as I go. There we go. So everything that's facing the light is going to get the most light. So rocks over on the left-hand side, the right-hand side of them is going to be brighter. Rocks over on the right-hand side, highlights are going to go on the left-hand side. So it's kind of the opposite. It's a good way to remember it. Once your rocks are dry, one last time, we're going to take the smallest round pointed brush. We're going to take some titanium white, a little bit of red, hint of Mars black, and we're going to create the brightest pinkish, purplish gray that we've created yet for the water. And I can test that right in the splashing areas because previously that was the brightest. And we're just going to further heighten those a little bit and make sure that the splash works its way up over our rocks. Because when we started to repaint the highlights and the edges, we did go over the water a little bit, and we don't necessarily really want to do that. So here I'm just going back and making sure that we have all of those applications the way we want them to be. There we go. It's going to get darker as we move over here because the light can't work through the rock. Same goes with the right-hand side of these. It's going to be brighter, and then the left-hand side is going to be darker. We can have a little bit on these rocks, but not too much. I'm also working it around the back of the rock slightly to about the third or halfway point, but I'm only doing that loosely, and I'm not trying to get it to be a consistent stroke. I am trying to get the brush to jump a little bit so there are slight openings, some diversity, and it'll just make it a bit more interesting. Here I'm also adding a little bit of a splash in front of a couple of these rocks. These are quite close, so you will see little details like that. So I'm just tapping on little bits of highlight. So as we step back, we get to see the entirety of our painting, and at this point, really all that's left is just touch-ups. And that's really going to vary from person to person. Maybe you want to work on the clouds, maybe the rocks, maybe the water. Really up to you, but I'd really like to say congratulations to you for making it this far, for investing the time to learn something, to get better at the craft. And I really hope you enjoyed this lesson. We covered a lot in it. There's definitely a lot to learn, and I hope you enjoyed the process. But with that said, if you've been following the channel for a while, you know that at the end of these, I like to give a little code word, a little badge of honor that you can use in the comments to note that you made it this far. I'll know all of the people who also made it this far will also know, and I think it's so impressive when people do put this much time into getting better at something, and I feel like we should have a little way of knowing. So today our code word, we're going to have two. You can choose which one you'd like to work with, whatever inspires you. It could be summer. I feel like this painting does feel quite summery, despite the fact that we're painting it mid-fall. And the second code word could be glow, because I feel like there really is quite a bit of a glow going on right in the background of the painting. So whichever your favorite is, find a way to integrate it into the comments, be creative, have fun. And also, again, I'd like to say a big thank you to you for watching, for being a part of this community. I'd like to say a big thank you to our Patreon supporters for making this lesson happen. In no world would I be able to spend as many days as I did this week working on this, working on the initial image, kind of figuring it all out. And I'm so glad that we did spend the time. So thank you for allowing me to work on significantly more complicated lessons where we do teach a lot more. I am so proud of what we came up with here today, and in no world again would that happen without you. So thank you for providing me with the opportunity to teach. Thank you for providing these lessons for everybody else. Thank you for just being a part of the community and doing what you do. I'd also like to thank everybody else who's watching this video also for being a part of the community, whether you can support the channel or not up over on Patreon. I still really appreciate you being here, and I will see you next week with a brand new painting lesson. Remember, we do this every Saturday, so make sure you subscribe and hit the bell button. That way you're notified when the new lesson goes live. And again, leave one of those code words in the comments. If you are new to the channel, you can sign up to Patreon. There's a link in the description. Up there you can get the traceables, the reference photo, which I do really advise with this one. It's great to kind of test your colors on first before applying it to the canvas. That way you know it's correct. And again, there are the ebooks, there's the Facebook group, there are personalized art critiques, a bunch of fun things. Go check it out if you're interested. But again, I will see you next week. Really excited. And, oh, also, if you are supporting the channel up over on Patreon, I do want to do a new poll in the next couple of weeks, so look out for that. We will be voting for the next lesson or couple of lessons, and I'll also be accepting requests for ideas to integrate into those polls as well. I will provide a couple of websites where you can grab images from at a later date up over on Patreon, and then again we'll make the poll with those. But we're going to try that. I think it'll be a lot of fun to get your ideas, your feedback, and what you want, and then we'll vote on all of it and we'll see what wins. So thank you so much for stopping by. I will see you next Saturday, and above all, as always, stay creative.